in terms of world dynamics and developments, China stands at the forefront of all of them. And I wanted to maybe begin with, of course, the big splash for China in particular, but really the region as a whole, was the recent visit of Xi Jinping to Vietnam. Here he is with the head of the Communist Party of Vietnam, Mr. Trung, Nguyen Phu Trung. And here is what was said during this uh, um, exchange. It was the end of the visit.
到机场去了。这个你安排了，你看接接送送的，总理接，这国会主席送，都是非常隆重的这个礼遇。
Mà tôi thấy mấy ngày vừa rồi thì tôi thấy là cũng rất là tốt. Ra sân bay để về Trung Quốc, chắc là muốn nhắn gửi một cái là đồng chí cứ ghi thoải mái cái ấn tượng tốt đẹp, những cái kỷ niệm.
中越一家亲，同志家训，我们就沿着这个路走下去，中越关系啊，就会取得新的友谊和合作成果。
So I wanted to play that quickly and then just show the audience quickly that this relationship has actually quietly, while the United States has been hyping division, disputes in the South China Sea, what have you. Here is a graphic of how Vietnam and Chinese economic relations have been increasing over the last 7 to 8 years. There you see a massive increase in the trade volume overall, now over 200 billion US dollars, which, Carl, you noted on RT, rivals that of China-Russia economic trade volume. So I just wanted to bring this up because it is a big splash in the realm of the United States has been doing its best to divide these two countries. And it comes amid a myriad of developments where, despite all of the hype about China's collapsing, China's economy is in tatters. Ben, you're in Beijing now. Maybe you can begin to just maybe put some of this into context, what's happening here, and any reaction that you have to these developments.
Yeah, this is a very important visit by President Xi. It's important to emphasize that Xi doesn't travel abroad a lot. So, of course, he prioritizes these very important visits. They have a lot of symbolic meaning. And, you cannot understand this without understanding the U.S. attempt to try to divide Vietnam and China, which is not working. And this is often misunderstood. And the Western media has this very triumphalist perspective, right? They claim the U.S. is succeeding in recruiting Vietnam in its new Cold War against China. That's completely ridiculous. Vietnam has a clear policy of non-alignment. They have always maintained that policy. They do not align with any major power. They have their own independent interests. But Vietnam and China have very friendly relations. There are, historically, there definitely have been conflicts, including, unfortunately, there was even a violent conflict in 1979. But the point is that today, China and Vietnam have very good relations. And all the Western media that said that now, the U.S. upgraded its relationship with Vietnam and they now have a comprehensive strategic partnership. What they forgot to mention is that Vietnam and China have had a comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership for over 15 years. So yes, Vietnam did elevate its relations with the U.S., but now they're still not the level they've been at with China for 15 years. So keep that in mind, and not to mention the increasing economic relations that you discussed. So I think it's just really important to emphasize that, like China, Vietnam has a non-aligned policy. So yes, it's important to keep that in mind. China also is technically non-aligned. China does have a very close partnership with Russia, but they don't have a military alliance. They're not technically part of a strategic bloc a military bloc in the same way, because both of these countries, China and Vietnam, understand the importance of not getting drawn into foreign conflicts, and they want to maintain their policy of development. And both of these countries have been leading development. I mean, it's incredible if you look at not only economic growth, because, many economists fixate on GDP, which if you look at GDP measured in purchasing power parity, China and Vietnam have had some of the highest growing rates in the region. But there are other more important metrics. Look at their industrial capacity. In all of Asia and in the world, China has been leading industrial development. China, according to UN data, is now responsible for between 30 and 31% of global manufacturing production value added. The US is only around 15%, half of China. But also, if you look in Southeast Asia, Vietnam is the industrial superpower in the region and continues to grow and move up the value-added chain of production. We're not talking about just like toys and little trinkets. Like China did, Vietnam is moving up and producing more and more advanced technologies. And of course, they're sharing a lot of that knowledge between the two of them. They have very similar experiences. So I do think this was important. At the same time, you know, people shouldn't, I think, again, you shouldn't have a romantic view of this. Like, of course, I think absolutely what China and Vietnam are doing in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and developing is incredible. And everyone in the world should admire that. But we shouldn't have this romantic view that, you know, China and Vietnam are going to ally together against U.S. imperialism. I mean, it's a little more complicated in the sense that Vietnam doesn't want to get drawn into this new Cold War. And of course, it makes sense for Vietnam's own national interest, because if they abandon this non-aligned policy, then the U.S. will start imposing sanctions on them. And so Vietnam doesn't want to get drawn in. So that's why people should, I think, have a more nuanced view, and also I have even some people criticize Vietnam for the U.S. trip. Like, obviously, I do not enjoy seeing U.S.-Vietnam relations improve, considering the genocidal war the U.S. waged in Vietnam. But you have to consider it from the perspective of the Vietnamese leadership. And I think they are playing a very smart, a truly non-aligned role.
I agree with everything Ben said. And also, like, for the people who, you know, criticize Vietnam for their relationship with the U.S., like, look, this is a decision up to the Vietnamese people. It's none of your business. And really, Vietnam, as Ben said, has a very similar policy along a aligned posture with China, which means to be friends with all and enemy of none, which is the most sensible foreign policy a country can have. I wish United States have something like that, but you know, the best we can do is war. And you know, of course, why wouldn't Vietnam want to improve relationship with U.S.? China wants to improve relationship with U.S. so they can continue the flourishing of the trade relationship. It's the United States that's refused to have a good relationship with China. And Vietnam is probably the culturally most similar country to China. I mean, I used to live in Fountain Valley, California, right next to Little Saigon, the largest concentration of Vietnamese people outside of Vietnam. And let me tell you, I mean, like the culturally, China and Vietnam is so similar. Like, when I was watching the Xi Jinping state visit to Vietnam, one thing that visually was very striking is when they had the 21-gun salute for welcoming Xi Jinping, when the Vietnamese honor guards walk in, like their uniform and like everything is so similar to the People's Liberation Army. Like, if I don't like look closely, one glance, it just looked like the PLA. You know, that's how similar the two countries and their institution are. And yes, there were some bad blood in history. You know, there was a war in 1979. There was continued hostility in the 1980s. But for a lot of people who don't realize, a lot of that is ancient history. That happened, you know, since 1990. The Vietnamese leadership went to Chengdu. They had a secret meeting with then the Chinese leadership to end the hostility, and they actually demarcated all the land border between Vietnam and China, also in the maritime border in the Gulf of Tonkin, and so these are the examples the two sides have worked together. And today, the Chinese China is the largest foreign direct investment source for Vietnam, and the Chinese investment in Vietnam dwarfs whatever is U.S. figure. I mean, like, Biden went to Vietnam promising investment and all that, but we also know that the Biden had this build the world back, build the world better plan back in
Right.
2021. Now it's 2023. What happened to that? You know, like the U.S. is great at talking, but really, like when it comes to economic matters, there's no competition. U.S. cannot compete with China economically in the neighborhood. China remains ASEAN's largest trade partner, and Vietnam is largest trading partner with China from among the ASEAN nation. China has the largest trade with Vietnam, so it totally makes sense for the two to grow closer together. They have a very mutually complementary economy. Partly because the U.S. de-risking, the targeting Chinese industries, because U.S. now is pressuring multinationals and everybody to move their supply chains out of China. And then Chinese manufacturers saw this like, so what we're going to do is move our industry to Vietnam. And now we can have made in Vietnam label and keep exporting to the United States. And actually it's also the Chinese industry themselves, when they climb the value chain, they're also, this is a kind of the process a lot of the East Asian nations started on their path to development. They start at labor-intensive, low-margin industries that the West has abandoned and offsourced. But then they pick up the skills. They start to move up the value chain. They start moving up, making more valuable manufactured goods. And so now China they're moving the more labor-intensive process to Vietnam. And in the process, China is also helping Vietnam to upgrade its infrastructure. And China built the Hanoi's metro system. And like I said, China had this grand vision of Pan-Asian railway links, which will link cities in China through Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. So one day you can ride high-speed train from Shanghai to Singapore. I mean, that is something China can help Vietnam with. And China is currently already helping building power plants and ports and roads in Vietnam. And so this is literally a win-win situation. What they agree with right now is basically tabling their differences, because there's still dispute in South China Sea and all that. But they're agreeing to put us, okay, we agree to disagree. We can set aside our differences, but work on the things that is beneficial for both of us, which actually is a very sensible plan. Back to you. You were actually there, Danny, right? So
yeah.
Well, Danny, I want to add one quick comment, and then I definitely want to hear your perspective. But really briefly, I'll just say, when we're talking about China-U.S. relations or Vietnam-U.S. relations, we should keep in mind that what we're really talking about is trade. Neither China nor Vietnam, of course, they do not want to copy the U.S. political system in any way whatsoever. They're often frustrated at the U.S. for supporting, like these color revolution groups and so-called NGOs that are trying to destabilize the country, not only in Hong Kong and even in mainland China, but also in Vietnam. So when we're talking about the relations with the U.S., it's economic relations, because we have to keep in mind, again, the reality is the U.S. is the world's largest market in terms of consumption. It's been deindustrialized. It's not a major manufacturer anymore, but largely because the dollar is the global reserve currency and it's a big population and a big economy, it's the world's largest importer and market for consumer goods. And both China and Vietnam have big trade surpluses. They're export-led models of development, and you need markets to sell those exports to. That's the definition of a trade surplus, is someone has the deficit, and the U.S. has the deficit. Now they print the dollars in order to pay for that, which leads to global inflation, but because it's the global reserve currency. Anyway, we all know how that works. But the point is that China and Vietnam, they do need trading partners, and the U.S. is the biggest one. I mean, well, together they also are huge trading partners, but in terms of markets for their exports, right? Because Vietnam and China, as Carl mentioned, have a very complementary relationship, and there's a slight surplus for China, but it's more balanced than the U.S., where it's much less balanced because the U.S. doesn't produce anything that anyone wants, right? Except, again, stupid Netflix movies. So I just want to keep that in mind, because when people, especially like when the ultra left criticizes China or Vietnam, they're thinking like that by improving its relations with the US, Vietnam in some ways wants to adopt the US model. That's not true at all. They're strictly thinking in terms of trade, and then a lesser degree is Vietnam doesn't want to get caught in the new Cold War. That's simply why they're trying to do that.
The business of China and Vietnam is business. The business of United States is war.
Yeah. Yeah. And no, I mean, all of those are great points. I find the timing of, because symbolism is often degraded by the United States. Whenever you hear about, for example, the building a community with a shared future, right? The Western mainstream media will say, well, that's China's symbolic, meaningless statement. But optics actually do matter a lot for both China and Vietnam, because it's not about symbolism per se. It's about projecting a political message that asserts sovereignty. And I do believe that the reason why after the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of China, that's why Xi Jinping and Nguyen Phu Trong met right after that. And that's why they're meeting now before the end of 2023, as the United States has had to pull back and scale back, at least rhetorically, it's in some areas, its maneuvers toward China, its aggression on China, and has been mired in so many different areas. I do think that those optics matter, because by projecting a message of China-Vietnam cooperation on all levels, political and economic, that gives the message that, yes, this non-alignment, this neutrality, this non-interference is a very real thing for both countries. For me, what's interesting, I was able to go to Vietnam this past October for 2.5 weeks, and then I was in China in July. Ben, I know you're in Beijing now, living there, but I was lucky enough to be able to go there for a little under 2 weeks. And how I saw Vietnam is where China was maybe at the turn of the 21st century, rapidly developing, but because it's just at a different stage of development, it's not as advanced yet, but it is moving very quickly, where China was able to grow just magnificently, which is why people call that period up until now a miracle. Vietnam is very much emulating that, and the reform processes for both countries are very similar. You can just see it everywhere. And it's funny you bring up the uniforms, Carl, because if you look at even if you're around Beijing, I don't know if you've seen them, Ben, you can see kind of like the so-called national police. Right? They look like they're basically, they look like they're in the PLA and they're marching around. The uniforms are like the exact same thing. Like the government uniforms in Vietnam are very similar to that, without the big hats. So there's a lot of similarities. The political systems are very similar. The reform processes that they're undertaking are very similar. And also the approaches in terms of how to navigate both differences and, of course, points of solidarity and cooperation are very similar, right? De-emphasizing conflict and differences and really emphasizing cooperation. And so, for me, China has a lot of what Vietnam needs, and now Vietnam has a lot of what China needs. China needs to offset, it needs to offload. It is now focusing on quality, and without markets for China to be able to do that, then that causes problems. Just like for Vietnam, without a market like China's, which is reliable, stable, and has exactly what Vietnam needs, especially in infrastructure. That is one of the huge weaknesses. You mentioned the metro system, Carl. It's a very small system right now because it only goes a couple of districts in Hanoi. And the way Hanoi and a lot in the bigger Vietnamese cities are constructed, while they are very efficient if you own a motorbike, there is a lot that needs to be done to ensure that these massive cities of scale, dense and pretty big. And because they're so dense, actually hard to get around in by car. They are. It takes quite a while. If you end up in any traffic at all, your trip is quite long. So it's important for these two countries to get closer. And the fact that China can help speed up Vietnam's transportation infrastructure, rail links was the big topic. It makes a lot of sense. And the conflict, I think this is a big, in my opinion, this is a big thumb in the eye of the United States, which has been trying to tout its relationship with Vietnam as kind of the hallmark of how the United States is encircling and successfully isolating China in the region. By doing this right at the end of the year when the United States is most vulnerable, I was there, and there was already talks about Xi Jinping coming at the beginning of November. So I'm not going to predict that the reason why they pushed it all the way to December was to stick a little Christmas gift to the Biden administration. But at the same time, I wouldn't put it past it, given that these messages are very important, and it comes at a time where China's prestige is just through the roof, and Vietnam's growth is consistent and likely to continue on this path of, as you said, Carl, just impressive, and Ben, just an impressive rate of growth, and needs to continue that process.
I mean, the gravitational pull of the Chinese economy is such that, when the rise of China, the tide lifts all boats. It actually, when China become prosperous, it lifts up the whole neighborhood. And this is something that benefits both China and its neighbors. And the programmatic approach that China and Vietnam work through their differences and work together, I think that's actually a good model for a lot of bilateral relationship. I mean, we could always also learn something from that, but how to agree to disagree, but work on the things that are important and mutually beneficial. And one of the thing about the kind of the U.S. trumpet somehow this Biden visit to Vietnam as like a victory against China, that just reflects the zero-sum mentality of the United States ruling elite. It's all about it's win or lose. Whereas like you can win. This is why China for a time was able to maintain friendly relationship in the Middle East with both Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, because that was China's goal, to be friends all and an enemy of none. And that's something that U.S. doesn't understand, because when you want to be the unipolar hyperpower, the full spectrum dominance over the globe, you see everybody as a competition. You see you're paranoid. You're always looking over your shoulder, trying to see someone is trying to take your top spot. But that's not what China even going for. China, countries like China and Vietnam, they're still primarily focused on their internal development, to pull their own people out of poverty, to bring them into middle class, to develop world-class infrastructure. The world hegemony is something like very far from their concern, their daily concern. But that's how the Washington Hawks thinks.
Well, I've kept you guys for 2 hours, and that was the limit we set out. We started a bit late, so I don't want to keep us any further. You guys, thanks so much. Do you want to let people know where to find you? We'll end the show here. But yeah, where can people find you, support you?
Yeah, I have my own YouTube channel, so everyone should subscribe to Danny's. And then after, they should go to mine, which is Geopolitical Economy Report. And you can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com and you can find all the other links there. And my videos are also a podcast, so if people prefer listening. And people, after subscribing to Danny's channel and my channel, they should also go and subscribe to Carl's. Go ahead, Carl.
Right.
Thank you, man. I have my own YouTube channel, Carl Za. So come subscribe. But right now they're demonetize all my videos on Palestine. You know, like
Yeah, that's the
they just
deal.
automatically do that. So I also have a Patreon site where you can support me. You know, I post some more premium stuff on my Patreon site. I do like. Currently, I'm doing a chronological retelling of the Chinese history from antiquity, well, eventually to the present. But now I'm like 546 BC, so I'm doing this like detailed retelling of the grand Chinese history. If that's your thing, you know, subscribe, check out my Patreon, Silk and Steel podcast, or just look at my YouTube channel. You know, I talk about. I'm also a prolific shit poster on Twitter, so you can find my handle Carl Saab. You know, so if that's your thing.
Well, thank you. I put your YouTube links in the chat, so be sure everyone to catch those before we go. But yes, before we all leave, everyone hit the like button and be sure to subscribe to this channel. Be sure to look up Carl and Ben's work. And if you want to support this channel, all the links are in the video description: Patreon, Substack, Buy Me a Coffee, and more. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. Have a good night or a good morning for our guests in Asia. And I will see you all again soon. Bye-bye.